People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. With a view to having more in-depth, detailed conversations with more than one guest at a time on areas and issues that impact your life, from tonight we'll be bringing you the People's Platform on Fridays at 8 p.m. as an hour-long discussion. Advancing labour rights and protections is the topic of discussion tonight. We just marked May Day, which is historically significant for labour rights the world over, also for Sri Lanka, serving as a platform for workers to advocate for improved conditions and policy changes and uniting workers across sectors. I'm so pleased to welcome to the show for the first time Dr. Gayathri Lokuge, researcher at the Centre for Poverty Analysis. Good evening and welcome. I'm also pleased to welcome to the show Lakmali Hemachandra, attorney at law. Welcome to the show, Lakmali. My first question is to Gayathri. Gayathri, research shows that following the multiple crises in Sri Lanka, there is an expansion in the informal labour sector. So workers in the informal sector lack legal protections, there are no employment contracts, there's no retirement benefits, no medical insurance, as a result of which they are vulnerable to exploitation by employers. So if you could, to set the stage, take us through what is entailed in this informal sector and where are we at right now?
Yeah, so first of all, I think let me say this. So we are, I can talk about the informal sector, but we are also seeing increasing informality within the formal sector.
Okay.
So there are people who are employed within formal institutions, establishments, could be factories, but their contracts are increasingly becoming informal. Right. So this is also a growing trend.
Okay.
So we're actually talking of a few things when we talk of informality, in a sense. And again, something that I should also stress is that, some people actually take the term non-formal rather than informal, because these definitions also vary quite a lot across disciplines, for example, right? So you take the legal definitions that would carry one set of definitions, whereas you go to the statistics, the data, the research, or the social science, sociological aspects, then those definitions of formality, informality may be different to what the legal discipline state. So So that is sort of, my first impression of, informality. And I think within, so your question about whether we're seeing increase in informality in the labor sector, yes. Our work also shows this. Although, statistics may or may not really, support this for Sri Lanka, the current statistics. One of the other things that's happening is that people are also in and out of both formal and informal sector, right? So that is also increasing. So for example, people who decided like 3 years ago that I'm not going to, go fishing anymore because of the crisis, they are also now coming back into the sector, right? So we've seen, old people over 60, 65, sometimes 70, actually either coming on to the beach and, engaging in fisheries related activities, because I do quite a lot of work in the fisheries sector. Sure. We've seen like older men, just sitting on the beach, untangling fishing nets, repairing nets and things like that. We are also seeing men, because we don't see women getting on a vessel, a fishing vessel in Sri Lanka and going out to the sea. We do see older men getting on usually non-mechanized fishing craft. So these are like traditional crafts, and going out to sea. Could be subsistence, could be also for an income. Right? So this we are seeing as an increasing trend. It is because of the multiple crises you mentioned, but also the other aspect which you already mentioned is the fact that if you've been a fisher all your life, then you don't have that cushion, a pension or an EPF, to actually see you through the last 5, 10, 15 years of your life. So this is also something that is not really directly linked to the crisis, but characteristic of the sector. So I can elaborate on that maybe later.
So Gayathri, overall, multidimensional vulnerability, struggle, strife, these are words that we can use to describe.
Sure. First, so I think, polycrisis to begin with,
right?
Multiple crises. So it is, could be the pandemic, it could be the political economic crisis that we are still going through. It could also be manifestations of those, right? So things like, taking off the fuel subsidy, the kerosene subsidy is drastically affecting the small scale fisheries sector. So we see things like that, right? But then, multiple vulnerabilities, since you used the term, something else that I would also like to draw attention is that when you talk of labor, you can't talk of labor decisions as an individual. You're also talking of family conditions, right? Characteristics of a household, of a family. Who are the income earners? What are their, characteristics like? For example, what are their education levels, right? So it's all of those things. So it's multiple vulnerabilities, but also at different scales. You can talk of the macroeconomic, you can talk of the microeconomic, the household, the family dynamics, power relations, as well as individual choice. So these are all very closely, intricately, interlinked when you talk of labor market decisions.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction. Lakmali, I'd like to come to you. Labor market governance and working conditions are key prerequisites in ensuring decent work for all. And the state has a pivotal role to play in this respect. Over the past 2 years, the government has been in a process of labor law reform. Take us through where that's currently at.
So, current government started the labor law reform process back in 2023 May, and right now we are not entirely sure where the process is at. But what I can tell you is that that process has been extremely problematic up until this point.
Okay.
So when it started in May 2023, so usually labor law reform and labor policy making, labor decision making happens inside the National Labor Advisory Council.
Okay.
Which is made up of trade unions, employees organizations and the government officials who are advising the minister on how to take forward labor policy making. So this is what we call tripartite decision making, which is a good way of making decisions because it avoids conflict, it gives you a place to come into a consensus and discussion, and it doesn't necessarily, you rarely see a lot of debate outside of the NLAC on labor policy making because everything is discussed and resolved inside this institution. So for trade unions, you can go there and you can raise your objections if there is any. What we saw with the current labor law reform process was the process was entirely taken out of the NLAC, and we see the minister trying to make up his own ad hoc consultative process, which has created a lot of conflict for the process. Because when you don't adapt to the established process, which is tripartism, which is sort of an accepted ILO convention as well, you are sort of going against the international law and Sri Lankan traditions of labor law making in the country, right? So the minister, by his decision to take this out of the NLAC, has created a lot of conflict, which has continuously sort of it has slowed down the process, right? And it's not entirely also sure whether this is the right time to make labor law reforms because Sri Lanka is in economic crisis, a deep economic crisis, and you see a lot of changes in the labor market that is not normal. So this is not a good time to base ourselves on when we make decisions about, because this is a crisis, right? Like Gayathri said, it's a polycrisis, right? So this is not a normal situation. One might argue that, you can't wait for a normal situation to make these decisions, you have to make these changes. But then when you're not in a normal situation, so what do we have here now? We have, last year we had about 70% inflation in Sri Lanka, which means that the workers are expecting a massive hike in their wages, right? And can you deliver it now? You can't. So that's what I'm saying. Like, this is not a good time to make those decisions. And
sure. Lakmali, for the sake of completeness, hasn't this decision, this arbitrariness by the minister been challenged?
So it has been challenged in the ILO, which is International Labour Organization has treaty body monitoring. So they look at the conventions and they look at whether they are correctly applied in the countries. This tripartism is one of the main pillars of ILO, and that has been challenged by trade unions in the ILO.
Right.
And as far as I know, there is a process of getting the government's opinion right now in the country.
Okay, so it's ongoing.
It is ongoing. And right before the labour law reform process started, the minister also made steps to sort of exclude a certain group of trade unionists from the NLAC, and that has also been challenged in the Supreme Court. So there is a challenge to the process. I mean, it's ongoing. But apart from that, of course, even the content of the reform is also problematic, because Gayathri was talking about informality. Generally, these reforms are driving towards informality. So job security, wage security, things that we are used to having in the labour market are getting relaxed, because the government believes it's good to get investments in. This is a belief that we have, that investors don't come into Sri Lanka because we don't have lax labour laws, right? But if you look at the labour laws in Sri Lanka, in reality they are not really very stringent, and they are not very strictly complied. And if you look at the labour laws comparatively in other countries, they are not very different to our laws either. So if you look at countries like Vietnam, China, where most of the FDIs actually go to, the laws are quite similar to us. In fact, Vietnam is known as a labour-friendly country. This is quite the controversial opinion to have, but this is the reality. Their laws are actually better than our laws, right? So labour is not the attraction point for these countries to bring in FDIs. Definitely not treating your workers bad. That's not the USP that they have. So which is something that we are getting wrong here. We want to make our laws bad because we believe it will bring in investments, but what actually happens is it creates a very exploitative situation, and it drives the labour force into informality, and it creates a situation where the productivity of the labour force entirely goes down.
Yeah. Gayathri, would you like to comment on this toxic trend?
Of like creating more informality, is it? Yeah. So I do agree with Lakmali on that, because, and this is what I alluded to also in my initial comment, that we are increasingly seeing informality within the formal sectors, right? You take the apparel sector, for example. We are hearing, I mean, I personally don't have statistics on this, but we are hearing more and more workers actually approaching the informal employment provision agencies, called the manpower agencies, where they don't actually have those monthly contracts, they don't have VPF, ETF, any of that, right? And these are all well documented. So it's so you see that kind of increasing trend. So it's I mean, and I think in very close to this discussion, it's also this term flexibilization, flexible working conditions, right? Now, it's a bit of a, it's a very tricky term, right? So on the one hand, I think one of the things that the pandemic COVID-19 did, not just in Sri Lanka, but globally, is really bring home this realization that this fixed working hours, like 8-hour work day, may not be the best way to go about, right? And in Sri Lanka also, increasing, I mean, this discussion of, okay, we need to facilitate these flexi working conditions became sort of the norm, right? Even in the public sector. However, with this, and then with this realization, then what do we do about this? Is where it becomes a bit problematic, right? And I think this, probably Lakmali can elaborate on this better than me from a legal perspective. But when you take things like those fixed work hours away because you want to be more flexible, there's also the tendency that your work hours become actually 16 and not 4. Okay, and then those 4 working hours also may not get the same kind of, or the benefits that it's entailed in it, right? So these are the things, it's the real tricky places that we have to watch out for when you're also talking of this labor law reform process, right? The other thing with these flexi arrangements is that there's a lot of work, there's a lot of discussion around flexi work and women coming into the workforce, right? So this thing that, okay, if women are actually allowed to work from home, they can balance their work at home, which is usually unpaid care work, and their paid work, right? So there is also that argument being put forward to in order to, you know, either grow the economy, increase women's labor force participation and things like that. So this is also something very tricky, and that's something that we should watch out, because if we're actually increasing women's burden, you know, their work, whether it's unpaid or paid burden, by actually facilitating such flexi work, then it's, you know, it's actually, obviously it backfires on women. Right?
Yeah.
So if you don't redistribute the unpaid work that happens at home among men, women, and other, you know, it could be older women, it could be younger boys, and still expect women to work from home, and, you know, facilitate that kind of process, then, you know, we are actually losing the argument there. So I think this is something we should watch out for.
Yeah, I'd like to get into this unpaid care burden in detail over this conversation. We're going for a short commercial.
The People's Platform.
That is the situation currently, but we have to fix somewhere now.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. Advancing labour rights and protections is the topic of discussion tonight. I'm in conversation with Dr. Gayathri Lokuge and attorney at law Lakmali Hemachandra. Gayathri, I'd like your perspective on the exploitative, misogynistic societal foundations which thrive on the unpaid labour of the woman. We briefly touched on this before the break. Mm-hmm. How toxic is it for society and for the woman?
Yeah, the thing is, the current political economic order basically relies on this unpaid care, that is care work that is performed primarily by the woman, right? I'm not saying that there aren't men in Sri Lanka as well that do not perform this. So you take some of the statistics. So the Department of Census and Statistics of Sri Lanka published the first time use survey in 2017 that is attached to the labor force survey, and in that one of the statistics is that if I remember right, women perform about 3 hours 20 something minutes of time on household work more than men.
Right.
And I think that is about and women again spend more time on what we call care work as well. So that is, looking after children, the elderly in the household and things like that. So it's, we do see the statistics, right? And we do see that it's very gendered in Sri Lanka. Of course, things are changing. So we do hear and we do experience, the younger generations where these care work and household work is becoming, more equally redistributed. But, interestingly, we did a very small online survey in 2020-21 during the COVID time when everybody was at home, basically, right? And there was home, there was school at home, there was officers at home, and we did sort of a very brief time use kind of analysis to see whether, since everybody is now at home, whether men would be actually taking up more care work and household work. The difference was very small. Still, women were spending a lot more time doing both household work and care work than
so it's
men.
Been so normalized and is expected of the woman with these patriarchal norms, with the religious, cultural baggage that we carry.
Yes. And we do see, if you take the labor force statistics as well, the gap, so we know that, women's labor force participation is quite low. Still, it remains low in Sri Lanka. And that gap between men in the labor force and women in the labor force actually widens by the time women get older. So by the time they get married and start having children, they actually drop out of the workforce, right? So it's so that there is a clear case to be made as to this link between the unpaid care responsibilities for women at home and their decision to join the paid labor force.
Lakmali, when we talk about unpaid care work and its gendered lens, where women are disproportionately impacted by this, how can we bring in legal protections?
Yeah, so adding to what Gayathri said, actually very recently, there was an ILO research on ILO Sri Lanka did a research on unpaid care work.
Okay.
And there was an event, and I remember Professor Dileni Gunawardara, if I got her name right. She was actually saying that unpaid care economy in Sri Lanka is 14% of the GDP, which is higher than the contribution of agricultural sector to the GDP. It's just that this is not accounted in the gross domestic product as something that is adding value, right? Because it's not paid. So this whole economy is riding on the unpaid care work that women do, and and it's affecting women in very harmful ways. So one of the key expectations out of the labor law reform process is also to bring more women into the labor force. And we have to admit, in Sri Lanka we do have a very low female labor force participation, which is about 31% right now. So that's very low. And this is a huge part of the labor force that's not engaging in what we call paid work or productive work, right? So either their labor is underutilized, it's not formalized. So we need this labor to, if you think about development and so on, it will basically add about 2% to the GDP, to the growth of the country if you bring all these women into the labor force, right? So how do we do that? Basically the idea right now and what is being floated around is that if you make work flexible, like Gayathri suggested, that not suggested, like Gayathri mentioned, that if you make labor flexible, then women can take part in more paid work, because then they will have time to do housework, care work, and then also do some sort of paid work, right? But how unfortunate for women is that we have more women in higher education than men sometimes. We have free education for all women in Sri Lanka. So we see a lot of social advancing of women in the country.
Yeah.
But we are not able to translate that into productivity in terms of the economy, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because we still want women to stay at home and do a certain part of care work. So obviously there has to be some structural change in how labor law reforms are done and how we look at the economy and how we look at the household as well. So I mean, if you look at the garment sector, which Gayathri also referred to, if you look at the garment sector, it's a highly feminized labor force. You have almost 70% women in the sector, right? And the maternity return rate of the apparel sector, according to the employer's own studies, is below 30%, which means out of all if you take 100 women, only 30 women return back to work after giving birth, right? Which is very unfortunate. So this is something that can be fixed through policies, and there are countries which have fixed this through policies as simple as childcare support,
Sure.
right? And extended maternity leave, parental leave, paternity leave. So there are so many ways that you can support women to stay in the labor force and make a paid living without becoming some part-time worker and getting their labor underutilized, right? Which this is not, some people think of this as some sort of a waste of money. So if you look at maternity leave, when we talk about it, most people would say, but then we have to bear the cost of the maternity leave, right? But then you don't see the bigger picture. You don't see that more women will come into the labor force. You don't see that they will stay longer in the labor force, right? They will become more trained workers, their productivity will go up, and our economy will be benefited by this. So we have to look at the larger picture. This is not just about getting one woman and relieving her of the unpaid care burden, right? It's also about getting a huge part of 52% of the population in Sri Lanka is women, but they're not entering into paid work. They're not coming to factories. They're not coming into formal sector work, and we need to fix that. So just by getting them to do work for part-time wages, which will make them actually poorer and which will increase the gender pay gap, is not a solution. What we need is proper legal provisioning like childcare support and extended maternity leave, which will actually support them to join the labor force.
Gayathri, what we don't want is for women to have to do housework and all the other unpaid care work and look after the parents and the in-laws and do the cooking and the cleaning and the wifely duties, and then also go and do paid work and then come back home and be an exhausted human being who hates her life. How do we prevent this from happening?
So I think picking up from what Lakmali also mentioned, childcare support is critical, right? So right now, we do have childcare as well as elderly care. Yeah, even more important. I think. So childcare, we do have at least in certain areas, certain sectors, we do have the daycare centers for children, right? And the question, of course, remains whether they are regulated. So there are questions about quality and about accessibility and affordability, right? But if we fix those, then at least a structure, a system exists. But that is also, is it during the full day? Is it only half day? So there are questions like that, right? But when it comes to elderly care, the picture is even more drastic, right? So you do have, according to statistics, there's only about 1% of the elderly in Sri Lanka that is in institutions. So this is because this is really not the culture, right? For the country, we don't, parents being in institutions is not really accepted as in our cultures. Now, this is going to become even more, I think, quite a concerning thing with these recent trends of migration. The middle class, lower middle class, the upper middle class, right? So who's going to look after these parents, right? So this need for regulated, accessible, and of quality that is assured care facilities is a must. Who should be funding this, right? So obviously the regulation, the regulatory authorities has to be the state, but I think especially for elderly care, one solution is also probably not going to work. We will obviously see an increase in the paid institutions, right? Because there is an increasing demand, so there will be a supply. But these are going to be 150,000 rupees, 200,000 rupees per month kind of institutions. But then you have the other end where they are completely free, but the quality is, very questionable. And you take the workers in those institutions, they are sort of at the bottom of the barrel. The only requirement so we did a study on this, and this the only requirement that the employers would be looking at would be that they're willing to work in an elder's home, right? Wow. Qualifications, none of that was really, they couldn't afford to look at any of those.
Right.
So that has to change. The labor conditions have to be regulated, decent working conditions, so that sector can also attract skilled workers. There's also a demand for skilled workers going up, but that's not necessarily local demand. It's like a global demand, right? So, one of the migration paths, it's actually this care service provision, right? So how do we then, sort of pivot those to match the growing demand within the local context as well? So that is something that the policymakers, obviously the private sector is going to now, come in and start establishing and, sort of taking up this market, but there are people who will not be able to afford those. So what are we going to do to those? One final thing is that we know, and I don't know whether this still actually exists, but there was a pilot project in the suburbs of Colombo as a daycare center for the elders.
Right.
And it was community managed and community driven. So it was established at the community level. It ideally should be linked to the public health officers, right? So we have the public health midwife for the children. It could be the PHI or could be a different officer, right, in charge of the elders, and that it is regulated. But that this actually then functions as basically a daycare center for the elders, right? So where their life, the quality of their life will also increase, because then they can hang out with people of their own age, and there could be activities, things like that. So it's actually win-win for people who provide care as well as for people who receive care. So this is also something that can make I feel a big difference.
So Gayathri, for policymakers, this can't be rocket science, because the science is there, and also there are international examples. I mean, if other countries can very easily, with very little resources, do it, why can't Sri Lanka? So Lakmali, in terms of having the political will to bring in initiatives like this, where's the hold up? We can also look at private-public partnerships, right?
Yes,
there are so many formats that can be used. It's really not that hard. So what are we lacking?
So I think what we're lacking is leadership, in the sense that if you look at where we make these decisions, if you look at the parliament, and like I said, if you look at the ministries, National Labour Advisory Council or wherever, you don't find many women in these places, right? So, I mean, not to say that only women can make decisions about women, but these are basics that women can actually understand and can push through, right? But when you have only 12 women in the parliament, and when you don't have any women in the National Labour Advisory Council, then who's going to speak about this? I think one of the main problems we have is leadership, that there is no leadership by women in our political spectrum, right? And the other issue is, of course, the reluctance to talk about these things. So if you talk about, let's say, if you talk about care work, and so what Gayathri was basically talking about is the creation of a care economy, like a proper functioning care economy where you don't have to make women work extra. Basically, they'll be working double time, just because we are not willing to accept that, you know, maybe this idea of the mother and the wife and the daughter traditionally taking care of the family is not the way to go forward, right? So are we willing to accept these ideas, and are we willing to look at how we have been functioning for decades and review how we have been functioning for decades and see, you know, maybe we need to now release women out of these functions, these duties, and let them grow as human beings, and let our economy grow better and make our families more functional and happier and healthier, which this will make. And it's interesting, you earlier mentioned that women are exhausted at the end of the day, right? Which is entirely true. So this has a terrible effect on mental health of women, it has a terrible effect on mental health of children, and it creates a mental health crisis in the country, which we are going through right now.
Absolutely.
So the implications of what we are suggesting is huge. I think it can entirely change how our country is functioning by just sort of not revolutionizing, by looking at this through not in terms of piecemeal solutions, but as more structural solutions, right? So you see there's a problem, and without suggesting part-time work, let's really talk about the issue, right? So let's bring in solutions. And as you said, this has worked in the rest of the world. This has worked in places like Brazil, you know, in Scandinavian countries, this is working. In Europe, this is working. In China, in Russia, I mean, you name it. Any country, this has worked. Basically, this is the standard procedure of releasing women's labor into the formal labor force. But we are not willing to do that for some reason. And I believe it's basically, first is the lack of political leadership. And by that I mean not enough women in politics. Second is the cultural barriers that we have. These are like, we are arrested in our own minds. We don't think in a forward-looking way. So that has become a problem for women.
Gayatri, how do we bring in the men? Women's issues are men's issues as well. Men need to be a key stakeholder in ensuring and enabling that a level playing field is created, an equitable playing field is created for women and for society.
Yeah, so I think, I feel like topics like this, one of the main things that need to happen is that they need to get picked up within families first, right? So, Lakmali mentioned that we've sort of, there's like we are sort of trapped in our own thinking, our own values, right? So one way forward is that we take up topics like this and we discuss them at home, right? And we also lead by example in a way. So we should be seeing more and more fathers setting an example for their sons by engaging more in household work, right? So sharing this work that happens in the household with the wife. So this is one area where I see change can happen, how men can also play an active role, but also men can also be the change makers themselves, right? Now as Lakmali very rightly said, men are in these decision making positions, right? So it's actually while we get more women, while we advocate for more women to be in these positions, not just for this reason, for lots of other reasons, we also need men out there picking up these topics and talking about these topics, right? So, and I mean, I feel like there is, and again, I don't have statistics to prove this, but the younger generation, we do see, a change in their approach to this whole thing of, what happens within a household. So one can at least hope that, there will be change coming up soon for Sri Lanka as well. So this is, another. So there is this, what I'm saying basically is that men need to step up at the household, the family unit, at the community level as well, and then at the higher decision-making level. So there is definitely responsibility with them to give space for these topics and, proactively bring these topics up, like social welfare, social services, care support, social benefits and things like that.
We're on to our last final few minutes, so I'd like to ask Lakmali, what can we as citizens do when there is a process of labour law reform? It can't be a top-down process where we're just the beneficiaries or the aggrieved party. We also need to be actively engaged. We need to educate ourselves on what's taking place, and we need to challenge arbitrariness if there are such instances. So what do we do?
Yeah. Before I answer that, actually I forgot one thing about the previous question. So apart from the cultural barriers and the political leadership, I also think it's extremely profitable to exploit women like this. And that has been one of the driving forces in this short-term thinking about how to make more profit without looking at economic growth in the larger sense and the bigger picture, right? So I think our private sector especially has a duty to look at this in a more broader, more out of the short-term profit thinking. It's entirely necessary to do that. Otherwise, we are just stuck in because whatever the government says, whatever the families say, if the workplace doesn't change, we can't change this, right? So it has to change there as well. And about what you asked about how do we contribute to the labour law reform process. So one of the ideas of getting the NLAC, the National Labour Advisory Council, to do this is to actually make sure that workers are able to take part in the process through trade unions.
Right.
But unfortunately for Sri Lanka, we don't have a lot of workers, especially in newly formed sectors, in the trade unions. So even if you look at the apparel sector, we don't have a lot of trade unions and the membership is very low, right? So then how do we make sure that people who are not in the organized workforce can contribute to the decision-making process in terms of labour law reforms? I think one way we can do that is to organize ourselves and make sure, because it's really difficult to be heard when you're talking alone, right?
Yeah.
So you have to, it doesn't necessarily have to be a trade union, but you can have organized platforms to talk about these issues. And it's very important that workers of all spectrums, wherever you are, including, media and so on, you can talk about these things. So that's one thing. And the other, I think one other thing is, we have this misconception that labour laws are only applicable to people who are in factories or people who are doing manual labour, right? But all of us are workers one way or the other. If the labour law reform process informalizes the laws and removes protections on job security, wage security and social security, it's going to affect every one of us. So I think one thing that we also need to do is look at the idea of a worker outside of the traditional workforce and look at the, the trishaw driver, the gig worker who's like some food platform driver, driving platform driver. These guys are also workers. Everybody is a worker. So then these laws are going to impact you one way or the other. Maybe you're not covered right now, but it's also your job to make sure that you are covered, right? Yeah. So without raising your voice, you're not going to get anywhere. So be informed, be heard. That's what we need to do.
Okay, fantastic. Gayathri, my final question to you. As an academic and a researcher yourself, you are only too familiar with the long hours of research-based work you do, and the disconnect it has with policymakers. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how insane is it for Sri Lanka to have such a rich, diverse pool of researchers, specialists, experts on various fields, and then policymakers just sit in parliament and randomly make decisions without consulting any of the experts, without consulting any of the people working on the ground?
Yeah, you put me on spot. Okay, so this is the thing, right? Policy making is, I don't think it's ever a very linear process, right? It's always fraught with, I mean, there are challenges, there's take up, there's pushback, but there is, uptake as well, right? So when it comes to, this nexus between research and policy making, I mean, what I think as researchers and academics, how, at least the groups of people that I am familiar with, what we also do sort of is, use these multiple strategies, right? So while we produce like things like policy briefs and, requests from, meetings and for presentation slots and things like that with parliamentarians, with, government bureaucrats, we also tried to reach the public and create a public debate, right?
Sure.
And I think this is why, some of us are in platforms like this.
Sure.
Because we also believe that, creating that public debate is equally important. And then there is one way that you can then, reach or at least shape and influence policy, right? So that's, and then, one example that actually, became quite topical and it got picked up by a few of the parliamentarians and the parliamentary committees is this debate on period poverty. There was analysis on the tax issue, what it does to the school children, right? So it built up momentum. So there was, and I think that's also because it was, it's sort of multi-pronged kind of, approach and strategy. So I feel like, yes, on the one hand, and I'm only talking about, this from a researcher and my perspective. What should the politicians be doing? The parliamentarians, decision making. I mean, that's again, it's a giving space, giving ear, and just being sensible. I guess in a way.
All right, fantastic, Dr. Gayathri Lokuge and Lakmali Hemachandra. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I did.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching us. Have a safe weekend. We'll see you again next Friday. Good night.